The rain hammered relentlessly against the windows of Blackthorn Asylum, its towering silhouette looming over the cliffs like a menacing sentinel. Once a sanctuary for the mentally ill, the institution had been shuttered decades ago after a string of unexplained deaths. Yet its reputation for horror endured. Stories of screaming halls, ghostly figures, and the whispered name of Dr. Elias Voss, the asylum's last and most infamous superintendent. The story began when Sarah, an aspiring journalist, decided to investigate the asylum for a feature on the most haunted places in the country. Despite warnings from locals and the haunting tales online, she was determined to uncover the truth. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a growing sense of unease, she entered the crumbling structure. The first thing that struck her was the smell, a rancid mix of mildew and decay. Graffiti marred the peeling walls and debris cluttered the hallways. Still, there was something else, something unexplainable, a heavy presence as if the building itself were alive and breathing. Sarah shook it off and ventured deeper into the labyrinth of shadows. As she explored, the whispers began. At first, she thought it was the wind sneaking through the shattered windows, but soon they grew distinct. Murmurs of pain, faint cries, and a woman's voice repeating, "Help me." She followed the voice, her footsteps echoing unnervingly in the empty corridors. The air grew colder as she descended into the basement, a part of the asylum where patients had been subjected to controversial treatments. Her flashlight flickered, its beam barely penetrating the oppressive darkness. Then she found it, the electroshock therapy room. Rusty gurneys lay overturned, and a maze of ancient machinery stood frozen in time. The air felt thicker here, heavy with misery. Sarah raised her camera, capturing the eerie stillness. That's when she saw it, a shadow moving across the lens, even though the room appeared empty. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. She spun around, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. A guttural voice rasped behind her. "You shouldn't have come." Sarah turned to find a figure standing in the corner, half hidden in the shadows. It was a man in a tattered lab coat, his face obscured, but his presence was suffocating. She stumbled back, only to feel icy fingers wrap around her wrist. Looking down, she saw a disembodied hand reaching up through the gurney, its grip tightening. She screamed, breaking free and bolting from the room. But the asylum wasn't finished with her. The walls seemed to shift, the corridors twisting and stretching as if guiding her deeper into its bowels. Blood-smeared words appeared on the walls. "Stay with us." Her heart pounded as she reached what appeared to be an observation room. The glass window revealed a chamber beyond, where patients had been kept in isolation. But what caught her eye was the chair in the center of the room. It was occupied. The figure strapped to the chair looked up, its hollow eyes meeting hers. It was the ghost of a woman, her mouth sewn shut, her hands clawing at the restraints. Sarah froze in terror as the woman's body began to convulse violently, her sewn lips splitting open to release a blood-curdling scream that shattered the glass. Shards flew in every direction, one slicing across Sarah's cheek. She stumbled back, disoriented and panicking, only to see her reflection in a cracked mirror. But it wasn't her face staring back. It was Dr. Voss, grinning maniacally, his eyes glowing with malice. "No," she shouted, smashing the mirror. Her voice reverberated, morphing into the sound of hundreds of voices screaming in unison. The asylum seemed to come alive, doors slamming, walls groaning, and the floor beneath her feet trembling. Sarah ran blindly, desperate to escape, but every hallway looked the same. Her flashlight went out completely, leaving her in utter darkness. Then she felt it again, a hand on her shoulder. This time, it was warm, human. She turned to see a young girl in a hospital gown, her eyes wide with fear. "They won't let you leave," the girl whispered. "What do you mean?" Sarah stammered. "They keep us here. Forever." The girl's form began to fade, her voice trailing off into the void. Sarah's mind raced as she stumbled through the asylum, her breathing ragged. She saw visions now, patients screaming as Dr. Voss administered cruel experiments, nurses crying as they were dragged into the darkness, and shadows stalking her every step. Finally, she found the main door. It wouldn't budge. Behind her, she heard the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Turning, she saw Dr. Voss, his ghostly form gliding toward her. His grin widened, and his voice echoed through the asylum. "You wanted a story, didn't you?" Sarah screamed as his hands reached out for her. The door behind her finally gave way, and she tumbled outside. She ran until she reached her car, her chest heaving and tears streaming down her face. She didn't look back. Later, as she reviewed the footage on her camera, Sarah's blood ran cold. Every photo she'd taken showed the same thing. Herself standing beside Dr. Voss, his skeletal hand resting on her shoulder, and a smile that promised she'd never truly left Blackthorn Asylum.
Story number 2.
St. Elred's Hospital was a hulking relic of a forgotten era, its red brick facade long blackened by mold and decay. Built in the early 1900s, it had once been a thriving institution dedicated to treating tuberculosis patients. But when advancements in medicine rendered it obsolete, the hospital was abandoned, left to rot on the outskirts of town. Over the decades, it gained a sinister reputation. Locals claimed the hospital was cursed, haunted by the souls of patients who had died in agony during the experimental treatments conducted there. Nathan, a seasoned urban explorer, prided himself on venturing into places others feared. For years, he had dismissed the tales about St. Elred's as nothing more than ghost stories designed to keep thrill-seekers at bay. But that night, standing before its broken doors, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Inside, the air was thick and damp, and a faint smell of antiseptic lingered despite the hospital's long abandonment. Nathan's flashlight swept across crumbling walls, shattered equipment, and hospital beds rusted into skeletal frames. As he moved deeper into the building, he began to hear faint sounds, footsteps shuffling just out of sight, the distant echo of a cough. He told himself it was his mind playing tricks, but the pit in his stomach tightened. He found himself drawn to the basement where St. Elred's morgue and surgical wing had been housed. The door to the morgue hung ajar, creaking softly as he pushed it open. The room was eerily pristine compared to the rest of the hospital. Row upon row of steel drawers gleamed under the flickering beam of his flashlight. A chill ran down his spine as his eyes landed on the largest drawer, which had been pulled halfway open. Nathan approached cautiously. The slab inside was empty, but dark stains coated its surface, dripping down onto the floor below. Against his better judgment, he reached out to touch the edge of the drawer. It felt unnaturally cold. A loud clang shattered the silence. Nathan whipped around to find the door to the morgue had slammed shut. He sprinted to it, yanking the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged as he pounded on the door, shouting for help. Then the lights flickered and went out entirely, leaving him in complete darkness. The whispers started, low, guttural, and incomprehensible at first. They grew louder, surrounding him. Then came the sound of dragging, something heavy being pulled across the floor behind him. Nathan froze, too afraid to turn around, but the sound drew closer, wet and deliberate. He finally spun to face the noise, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Its weak beam illuminated a figure crawling toward him. The thing was gaunt, its body twisted and broken as if it had been crushed under immense weight. Its face was pale and featureless, save for two sunken pits where eyes should have been. It reached for him with fingers that ended in jagged nails, leaving deep scratches in the tile. Nathan backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure spoke, its voice rasping like metal on stone. "We were left here, forgotten." Another sound erupted from the morgue drawers, pounding, as if dozens of fists were striking from within. The room filled with anguished cries, begging to be let out. Nathan's mind reeled as he realized the drawers were moving, each one slowly sliding open to reveal skeletal figures inside, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. He turned back to the door, clawing at it desperately. The whispers turned into laughter, cruel, mocking laughter. Suddenly, a hand shot out from one of the open drawers, grabbing his ankle and yanking him to the floor. He screamed as more hands emerged, clawing at him, dragging him toward the largest drawer. The last thing he saw before he was pulled inside was the crawling figure looming over him, its toothless mouth stretching into an inhuman grin. "Now you'll stay with us," it hissed. Nathan's friends reported him missing the next day when he failed to return home. A search party found his abandoned car outside St. Elred's, but inside the hospital there was no sign of him. The only clue was his flashlight, lying on the floor of the morgue, its beam still pointing toward the largest drawer. And though the hospital had been silent for decades, those who ventured near it afterwards swore they could hear pounding and muffled screams coming from deep within its walls.
Story number 3.
The Crestwood Sanatorium had always been shrouded in mystery and fear. Hidden deep in a forest, the asylum had once housed hundreds of patients deemed untreatable. In the 1950s, rumors of inhumane treatments and patient disappearances began to surface, but the real horror came in 1963 when all contact with the facility abruptly stopped. A search party found the staff and patients dead, their bodies unnervingly arranged in a circle in the dining hall. The cause of death was never determined, and Crestwood was sealed off, abandoned to time. That was until a group of amateur ghost hunters decided to film an episode of their web series Inside. Melanie, the skeptical but daring leader, convinced her friends to join her. Ian, the tech expert, Rachel, the empath who claimed to sense spirits, and Greg, the group's overconfident cameraman. Armed with cameras, EMF meters, and flashlights, they entered Crestwood on Halloween night. The first hour was uneventful. Dust-covered hallways stretched endlessly, and faded medical charts littered the floor. The air was stale, and graffiti from previous trespassers marked the walls. But as they ventured deeper, a strange silence enveloped them. No wind, no creaking floorboards, just a heavy, unnatural stillness. It began in the children's ward. Rachel, trailing behind the group, stopped abruptly, clutching her head. "Something's here," she whispered, her face pale. "They don't want us here." Greg laughed nervously. Classic haunted house cliché. But then they heard it. The faint sound of laughter, high-pitched and echoing as if coming from multiple children. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The group froze, their flashlights darting across the room. There was no one there. Melanie steeled herself. "It's probably an old recording or something. Let's keep moving." As they made their way down the hall, Ian's EMF meter began to spike erratically. The air grew colder, their breath visible in the dim light. Then the laughter returned, louder this time. A shadow darted across the corridor ahead of them, and Greg's camera caught it. He replayed the footage, but the shadow moved too fast to make out any details. "This isn't funny anymore," Rachel said, her voice trembling. They reached the operating theater, where the asylum's most infamous surgeon, Dr. Harlan Fitch, had conducted gruesome lobotomies. Rusted surgical tools lay scattered across the floor, and a massive operating table sat in the center, its leather straps still intact. The group set up their equipment, hoping to catch evidence of the paranormal. Suddenly, Ian's thermal camera picked up a heat signature on the operating table. "That can't be right," he muttered. Greg focused his camera on the table, and that's when it happened. The straps began to tighten on their own, as if invisible hands were pulling them. A loud metallic clang echoed through the room as a scalpel flew off the floor, embedding itself in the wall. Rachel screamed, clutching her chest. "Someone's here! He's watching us!" "Who?" Melanie demanded, but Rachel just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. The lights on Ian's equipment began to flicker wildly, and the sound of heavy footsteps filled the room, coming closer. They bolted out of the operating theater, running blindly down the dark halls. But Crestwood wasn't finished with them. They reached the old dining hall, the scene of the mass death decades earlier. Their flashlights illuminated a horrifying sight. The room was exactly as the search party had described it in 1963. The skeletons of staff and patients were still seated in a perfect circle, that as though frozen in time. But as the group watched, the skeletons began to move. The jawbones of the dead opened and closed, emitting an eerie, guttural chant in a language none of them recognized. The room felt like it was spinning, the walls pulsating as if alive. Greg's camera malfunctioned, emitting bursts of static. "Out! We need to get out!" Melanie shouted, dragging Rachel, who was frozen in terror. As they fled, they found themselves back in the children's ward. The laughter returned, louder and more menacing. Then doors began slamming shut one by one, forcing them down a single path. At the end of the hall stood a figure in a blood-stained doctor's coat. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow pits. In his hand, he held a scalpel dripping with dark, viscous liquid. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure rasped. His voice was like the grinding of stones. Ian swung his flashlight at the figure, but it vanished. The next moment, the hallway erupted into chaos. Lights exploded, debris flew through the air, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Screaming, the group sprinted toward the exit. When they finally burst out into the night, gasping for air, they realized something was wrong. The forest that surrounded Crestwood was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of mist. Their car was nowhere in sight, and the asylum, it was no longer behind them. Instead, they stood in a circle of crumbling gravestones, each one etched with their own names and the date, October 31st, 2023.
Story number 4.
The Stillwater Institute was a forgotten relic buried in the heart of the Appalachian woods. Built in the late 1800s, it was once a cutting-edge psychiatric facility, praised for its progressive treatments. But over time, rumors spread of bizarre experiments and patients disappearing without explanation. After a massive fire in 1928 claimed dozens of lives, the institute closed its doors forever. Decades later, the legend of Stillwater drew thrill-seekers and ghost hunters. Most fled the building after hearing unexplained noises or catching glimpses of shadowy figures. Few dared to return. James had heard the stories growing up, but as a struggling podcaster desperate for views, he decided to investigate. Armed with recording equipment, a flashlight, and his phone, he planned to document every eerie moment inside. From the moment he entered, the atmosphere was oppressive. The air was damp and heavy, and the building smelled of burnt wood and something far worse, something metallic and rotten. The walls were blackened with soot, but traces of old murals depicting serene pastoral scenes were still visible, their colors twisted by fire and decay. James began narrating into his recorder. This is where it all happened. The fire started in the East Wing, but some say it wasn't an accident. They say the patients revolted against Dr. Monroe, the head physician, and a loud crash interrupted him, coming from the direction of the East Wing. James froze, gripping his flashlight. He called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The only answer was the echo of his voice. He followed the sound, his steps crunching on broken glass and debris. As he turned a corner, his flashlight caught movement. A door at the end of the hall slowly swung open. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to leave, but curiosity and the promise of viral content pushed him forward. He entered the room cautiously. It was an old treatment chamber filled with rusted equipment. A tattered straitjacket lay in a heap on the floor, and a row of metal chairs lined the far wall, each one bolted to the floor. His eyes landed on a bizarre contraption in the center of the room, an archaic electroshock therapy machine. The leather straps on the chair attached to it looked new, untouched by time. He leaned in to examine it, noticing fresh scratch marks on the armrests. "Unreal," he muttered, filming the scene. Suddenly, the machine hummed to life, its dials spinning and sparks dancing across its wires. The overhead light flickered, casting distorted shadows on the walls. James stumbled back, dropping his recorder. A voice crackled through the static-filled air, low and guttural. "You shouldn't be here." James whipped around, his flashlight catching a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man in a doctor's coat, his face half hidden in shadow. But what James could see turned his blood to ice. The man's eyes were black pits, and his mouth stretched unnaturally wide, as if it had been carved into his face. The figure stepped forward, and the air grew colder. James tried to run, but his legs felt leaden, like he was wading through water. The man's voice echoed again, louder this time. "Stay, stay, and learn what they did to us." As the doctor approached, James's vision blurred. Images flashed in his mind. Patients screaming as they were strapped to the chair, their bodies convulsing violently, a woman clawing at the walls of a padded cell, and the staff, their faces twisted in fear as flames consumed the building. When James came to, he was sitting in the chair, the leather straps biting into his wrists and ankles. The machine before him buzzed ominously, its dials spinning faster and faster. The doctor stood beside him, his hollow eyes staring into James's soul. "You wanted the truth," the doctor said, his voice now an amalgamation of hundreds of voices, each layered atop the other. "You'll feel what they felt." James screamed, thrashing against the restraints as the machine roared to life. Electricity surged through his body, his vision exploding with white-hot pain. The voices of the dead filled his ears, a cacophony of agony and despair. When it finally stopped, James slumped forward, gasping for air. The room was silent again, the machine dormant. The doctor was gone. Shaking, James freed himself from the chair and bolted out of the building, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't stop running until he was in his car, speeding away from the institute. It wasn't until he got home that he noticed the scars, burns in the shape of the machine's straps etched into his wrists and ankles. His recorder, which he had managed to grab in his panic, still worked. When he played it back, there was no audio of his narration or the strange events he had witnessed. Instead, the tape was filled with screams. Dozens of screams, each one more blood-curdling than the last. As James sat in his dark apartment, he realized the truth. Stillwater hadn't let him go. Not really. And every night as he tried to sleep, he would hear the faint hum of the machine and the voice of the doctor whispering, "It's your turn."
Story number 5.
The Briarcliff Hospice had long been abandoned, a crumbling relic at the edge of the city. Originally built in the 1930s as a tuberculosis hospital, it was converted into a hospice in the 1970s before it shut its doors permanently after a string of unexplained deaths. Locals avoided the place, claiming it was cursed. Even during the day, the building seemed to exude a dark presence, its shattered windows resembling hollow eyes. Erica had never believed in ghosts. As a documentary filmmaker, she thrived on debunking urban legends. When her team suggested filming at Briarcliff, she eagerly agreed. Armed with cameras, motion sensors, and audio equipment, she and her 2 crew members, Matt and Lucy, set out to spend the night inside. The main hall was eerily quiet, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Graffiti and vandalism marred the walls, but the faint scent of antiseptic lingered, as though the building refused to let go of its past. "Creepy, but manageable," Erica said, her voice steady as she filmed. They decided to start in the patient rooms on the first floor. Each was identical, peeling wallpaper, rusted bed frames, and shattered windows. Lucy paused in one room, shining her flashlight on a wall covered in scratches. "They look like claw marks," she said, her voice trembling. Matt, the skeptic of the group, rolled his eyes. "Probably raccoons. This place has been empty for decades." But as they moved to the second floor, things began to feel wrong. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Erica's camera picked up strange interference, static lines that danced across the screen. "Did you hear that?" Lucy whispered, stopping suddenly. They strained to listen. Faintly, from down the hall came the sound of a woman humming. It was soft and melodic, but filled with an unmistakable sadness. "No way," Matt said, turning on his audio recorder. "That's got to be some echo or wildlife." The humming grew louder, echoing in the dark. The team followed the sound to an old nurse's station. The desk was overturned and paperwork was scattered across the floor, but the humming persisted. It was coming from behind a locked door labeled storage. "Should we open it?" Erica asked, her voice hesitant for the first time. Matt shrugged. "Might as well. Probably just the wind messing with us." Using a crowbar from their gear bag, Matt forced the door open. The room beyond was small and empty, except for a single wheelchair sitting in the center. The humming stopped abruptly. Lucy shivered. "I don't like this. Let's go back downstairs." But as they turned to leave, the wheelchair rolled forward, its wheels creaking loudly. Erica froze, her camera capturing every second. That's not possible," Matt stammered, backing away. Before anyone could respond, the door slammed shut behind them, the force of it rattling the walls. Erica's flashlight flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. When the light stabilized, they realized they weren't alone. A figure stood in the corner, a nurse in an old-fashioned uniform, her face obscured by a blood-stained surgical mask, her head tilted unnaturally to the side as though her neck had been broken. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice muffled and distorted. Lucy screamed, and the nurse moved, gliding across the room without taking a step. The wheelchair flipped over violently, crashing into the wall. Erica dropped her camera as Matt fumbled with the door, his hands trembling. It wouldn't budge. The nurse's presence filled the room, the air thick with a nauseating mix of antiseptic and decay. Suddenly, the nurse reached for Erica, her gloved hands stretching impossibly long. Just as the cold fingers brushed Erica's arm, the door flew open, and they bolted out, running down the hall. They didn't stop until they reached the main entrance, but to their horror, the door they'd entered through was gone. In its place was a solid brick wall. "It wasn't like this when we came in," Matt shouted, pounding on the bricks. The humming returned, louder this time, echoing from every direction. Shadows began to gather at the end of the hall, figures forming out of the darkness. Patients in hospital gowns, their faces sunken and hollow. "They don't want us to leave," Lucy sobbed. Erica clutched her camera, desperate for an escape. "There has to be another way." The shadows advanced, their movements jerky and unnatural. Hands reached out of the darkness, skeletal fingers grasping at the air. Just as they were about to be overtaken, Erica noticed a faint light coming from an open elevator at the end of the corridor. "This way!" she screamed, dragging Lucy and Matt toward it. They dove inside, the doors closing just as the shadows reached them. The elevator jolted to life, descending rapidly. But instead of the ground floor, it opened into a cold, dimly lit basement. The walls were lined with metal drawers, mortuary storage. On the far side of the room, a row of gurneys sat under flickering fluorescent lights. The humming was deafening now, reverberating through their bones. One by one, the drawers began to open. Erica dropped her camera and screamed as pale, emaciated hands emerged, followed by lifeless faces with empty eye sockets. The corpses crawled out, dragging themselves toward the trio. "No, this isn't real!" Matt yelled, but the gurneys began to move, pinning him against the wall. A cadaver grabbed Lucy's leg, pulling her to the floor. Erica stumbled backward, her mind racing. There was no escape. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the nurse, standing in the doorway, her broken head tilting back as she laughed. The footage was discovered weeks later, the camera miraculously intact despite the team's disappearance. No one who watched the tape could explain the horrors it captured, and those who did watch claimed they began to hear the humming in their own homes.
Story number 6.
The Ridgeview Psychiatric Hospital loomed on the outskirts of town like a sentinel of forgotten pain. Once a thriving facility in the 1920s, it shut down in the 1960s after a series of gruesome patient deaths and rumors of unsanctioned experiments. Locals swore the building was cursed. Even teenagers, emboldened by dares, rarely ventured near it. Dahlia wasn't like the locals. A budding journalist, she lived for uncovering dark truths. When she heard whispers about the Ridgeview rituals, a supposed occult practice by the hospital's last director, Dr. Emil Graves, she knew this story could launch her career. She convinced her best friend Mark, an amateur videographer, to join her for a night inside the derelict hospital. They arrived just before midnight. The building's facade was scarred by time, its windows shattered, and its roof sagging under decades of decay. A chill in the air seemed to warn them away, but Dahlia pressed forward, flashlight in hand. Inside, the hospital felt alive, as though the walls themselves were watching. The faint smell of mildew mixed with something more metallic, a coppery tang that clung to the back of their throats. Graffiti covered every surface, but amid the chaotic scrawls, Dahlia noticed a pattern. Strange symbols scratched deep into the walls. "What do you think this means?" she asked, tracing one with her fingers. Mark filmed it, zooming in on the jagged lines. "Probably just some wannabe occult stuff. You know how these urban legends go." But Dahlia wasn't so sure. The symbols felt deliberate, almost predatory. They made their way to the basement, where Dr. Graves had allegedly conducted his sessions. The staircase creaked ominously with every step, and the air grew colder, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. The basement was worse than they imagined. Chains hung from the walls, and a rusted gurney sat in the center of the room, its leather restraints still intact. Mark shuddered. Whoever was down here didn't leave willingly. Dahlia's flashlight flickered. She smacked it against her palm, but the light continued to falter. Then she heard it, a low guttural whisper, so faint she thought she might have imagined it. "Leave." "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark shook his head. "Hear what?" The whisper came again, louder this time. "You don't belong here." Suddenly, Mark's camera malfunctioned, the screen filling with static. He smacked it in frustration, but the static didn't clear. Instead, it began to show something else. The basement, as it had been decades ago. The screen revealed a group of patients strapped to gurneys, their eyes wide with terror. Dr. Graves stood over them, his face obscured by a surgical mask. He raised his hands, chanting in a language neither Dahlia nor Mark recognized. The patients screamed, their voices merging into an unbearable crescendo. "Turn it off!" Dahlia cried, but the camera wouldn't stop. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the footage disappeared, replaced by Mark's terrified face reflected in the lens. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice shaking. But the room had changed. The stairs they'd come down were gone, replaced by a solid wall. Chains began to rattle violently, and the gurney in the center of the room tipped over with a deafening crash. "We're trapped," Dahlia whispered. The symbols on the walls began to glow, pulsating with a sickly green light. The whispers returned, now overlapping and echoing from every direction. Dahlia spun around, her flashlight catching glimpses of shadowy figures moving just out of reach. Mark screamed as one of the chains wrapped around his arm, dragging him toward the wall. "Help me!" he yelled, his voice echoing in the confined space. Dahlia grabbed his other arm, pulling with all her strength. But the chain was relentless, pulling him closer to a crack in the wall that oozed a black, tar-like substance. The substance began to crawl up Mark's leg, seeping into his skin. His screams turned guttural, then stopped altogether as his eyes rolled back and his body went limp. "Mark!" Dahlia cried, but it was too late. His body was gone, swallowed by the wall. The whispers grew louder, forming words she could finally understand. One stays, one leaves. Dahlia felt an icy hand grip her shoulder. She turned and saw him, Dr. Graves. His surgical mask was gone, revealing a hollow, skeletal face with empty eye sockets that seemed to bore into her soul. "You wanted the truth," he rasped, his voice like nails on glass. "Now you'll become part of it." The chains lunged for her, wrapping around her arms and legs. She struggled, but the cold metal tightened, pulling her toward the center of the room. The glowing symbols on the walls pulsed faster, their light searing her vision. Her screams echoed in the basement, but no one outside would ever hear them. When authorities eventually searched the hospital, they found Mark's camera sitting on the rusted gurney, still recording. The footage was an incoherent mess of static and faint whispers. But in the final seconds, a single frame was clear. Dahlia, standing in the basement, her eyes hollow and her mouth twisted into a scream. Behind her stood Dr. Graves, his skeletal hand resting on her shoulder. No one ever dared to enter Ridgeview again.
Story number 7.
Deep within the New England countryside, the Ashmore Asylum was an infamous place no one dared to visit. Built in the 1800s, it was originally intended to treat the criminally insane. But over time, stories of inhumane practices, ice baths, lobotomies, and mysterious disappearances turned it into a symbol of cruelty. It was finally abandoned in the 1950s after a violent riot left staff and patients dead. Now it was merely a decaying husk of its former self, or so people thought. Elena and her boyfriend Rick weren't scared by ghost stories. They were paranormal enthusiasts who saw Ashmore as the ultimate challenge for their YouTube channel. Their plan was simple: spend the night inside and document everything. They brought infrared cameras, EMF detectors, and a spirit box to communicate with the dead. As they approached the asylum, the wind howled through the broken windows, and the structure seemed to groan as if warning them away. Still, they pressed forward, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The entrance hall was vast, its floor littered with debris and medical instruments left behind decades ago. Elena's camera captured the eerie stillness. "This place is insane," Rick said, running the EMF detector along the walls. It beeped weakly at first, then spiked suddenly as they reached the corridor leading to the isolation wing. The air grew colder, and Elena felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. "Let's check it out," she whispered, her voice trembling. The isolation wing was worse than they expected. The cells were tiny, with iron bars and scratch marks gouged deep into the walls. In one cell, they found an ancient straitjacket lying in a heap, its straps frayed and stained. "This is the real deal," Rick said, setting up the spirit box. The device crackled to life, spitting out static. "Is anyone here with us?" Elena asked. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a single word came through, distorted and faint. "Leave." Rick grinned nervously. "Well, that's encouraging." But Elena wasn't smiling. Her eyes were fixed on something at the end of the hallway, a shadowy figure standing perfectly still. "Do you see that?" she whispered, gripping Rick's arm. He turned, but by the time his flashlight landed on the spot, the figure was gone. "Probably your imagination," he said, though his voice betrayed his unease. They moved deeper into the asylum, eventually finding themselves in the electroshock therapy room. The equipment was ancient and rusted, but disturbingly intact. Elena set her camera down to record the room while Rick examined the machines. As he fiddled with the dials, the air grew heavy and the lights on their equipment began to flicker. The spirit box crackled again. This time a series of words came through, one after the other. Pain, fear, burn. Elena's breath caught in her throat. "Rick, I think we should stop." Before he could respond, the door to the room slammed shut and the temperature plummeted. Frost formed on the windows, and their breath came out in visible puffs. A loud, metallic screech filled the room as the electroshock machine powered on by itself. The straps on the chair tightened as if invisible hands were preparing for a new victim. Rick grabbed the camera, but the screen was nothing but static. "This isn't funny anymore," he shouted, yanking at the door. Suddenly, the machine stopped, and the room fell deathly silent. But then Elena felt it, a hand brushing against her hair. She spun around, but no one was there. "Did you feel that?" she gasped, clutching Rick's arm. Before he could answer, the spirit box spoke again, louder this time. "She's mine." The sound of chains rattling filled the room, and one of the straitjackets hanging on the wall fell to the floor. But it didn't stop there. The straps began to move on their own, writhing like snakes. Rick and Elena bolted for the door, slamming into it with all their strength. Finally, it gave way, and they stumbled into the hallway. But something was wrong. The corridor was different now. The graffiti and debris were gone, replaced by polished floors and pristine walls. The asylum was no longer abandoned. It was alive. Patients in hospital gowns shuffled through the halls, their faces obscured. Nurses pushed carts of rattling instruments, and at the end of the hallway stood a man in a black coat, his face hidden in shadow. Dr. Mortimer, the infamous head of Ashmore, known for his brutal experiments. "Visitors," he said, his voice deep and cold. "You've come to volunteer." The patients turned toward Alina and Rick, their faces now visible. Their eyes were hollow, and their mouths hung open in silent screams. Alina grabbed Rick's hand and ran, but no matter how far they went, the hallway stretched endlessly before them. Doors opened and slammed shut on their own, and the laughter of children echoed from unseen places. Finally, they burst into the morgue. The cold was unbearable, and the smell of decay hit them like a wall. Metal drawers rattled, and the corpses within began to stir. Rick screamed as a hand shot out from one drawer, grabbing his ankle and pulling him to the floor. Elena tried to help him, but the room was alive now. Gurneys rolled toward her, their straps lashing out like tentacles. The last thing she saw was the doctor, standing over Rick with a surgical scalpel, whispering, "The treatment is just beginning." When authorities searched the asylum the next day, they found no trace of Rick or Elena, but their camera was left behind, sitting in the electroshock therapy room. The footage, it showed the two of them standing in the hallway, staring blankly at the camera, their eyes hollow and lifeless. And in the background, the shadow of Dr. Mortimer loomed, his hand resting on Elena's shoulder.
Story number 8.
The Blackwell Sanatorium had been abandoned for decades, a massive stone structure shrouded in fog and secrecy. Built in the early 1900s as a tuberculosis ward, it later became a psychiatric hospital infamous for its brutal treatments. Stories of experiments, disappearances, and a mass patient suicide in the 1940s lingered like a stain on its history. After a fire gutted the building in 1963, it was left to rot. Claire was a skeptic. An urban explorer and part-time historian, she loved uncovering the truth behind old myths. The sanatorium's legends were too juicy to ignore. Despite warnings from locals, she set out one October evening with a flashlight, her camera, and a resolve to debunk the stories once and for all. The moment she stepped through the massive iron gates, the atmosphere changed. The air felt thick, and an unnatural quiet enveloped the area, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. The front doors hung off their hinges, groaning under the weight of years. Inside, the building was eerily preserved despite the fire. Wheelchairs were still parked in corners, medical charts lay scattered across the floor, and the faint smell of burnt wood mixed with something far more foul. Claire's camera clicked as she documented everything. She chuckled nervously at the peeling wallpaper and old operating tables. "This place is creepy, but haunted? Yeah, right." As she moved deeper into the sanatorium, the temperature dropped sharply. She found herself in the children's ward, the walls decorated with faded murals of animals and smiling faces. Small hospital beds lined the room, their rusted frames stark against the peeling pastel paint. Why did they even have a children's ward in a place like this? She muttered to herself. A faint giggle answered her. Claire froze, her flashlight sweeping the room. "Hello, is someone there?" The giggle came again, soft and distant, followed by the creak of a bed frame shifting. Claire's pulse quickened. She aimed her camera at the sound, but nothing was there. Brushing off her unease, she continued down the hall. The silence grew oppressive, broken only by the sound of her boots crunching on debris. She found herself in the surgical ward, where the fire had done the most damage. The walls were blackened, and the ceiling had partially collapsed. Claire's flashlight flickered as she approached an old operating table in the center of the room. The straps were still intact, and a rusted bone saw lay on the floor beside it. She raised her camera, snapping a photo. "Just a creepy old table," she whispered, trying to calm her nerves. The faint sound of dripping water caught her attention. She turned toward the far corner of the room where a sink stood beneath a cracked mirror. The faucet was dry, yet the dripping continued, louder and more insistent. When she looked into the mirror, her blood turned to ice. Behind her stood a man in a surgeon's coat, his face obscured by a blood-stained surgical mask. His eyes were black voids, and his gloved hands dripped with crimson. Claire spun around, but the room was empty. The only sound was her own ragged breathing. Her instinct screamed to leave, but curiosity pushed her forward. She moved into the next corridor, where the walls were covered in soot and strange symbols carved deep into the stone. "Looks like something out of a horror movie," she muttered, taking another photo. Suddenly, the symbols began to glow a dull red, illuminating the hallway in an otherworldly light. The floor beneath her vibrated, and a low, guttural moan echoed through the air. Claire backed away, heart pounding. "Nope, nope, nope," she said, turning to run. But the hallway was gone. She was no longer in the sanatorium she had entered. The walls were pristine, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the air. Patients in bloodied hospital gowns shuffled aimlessly, their hollow eyes staring into nothing. Orderlies pushed carts of surgical tools, their faces obscured by masks. Claire's flashlight flickered wildly, then went out. She fumbled with it, but when the light came back on, she was in a room she hadn't seen before. It was an office, neat and orderly. A nameplate on the desk read Dr. Henry Calver. The air buzzed with tension, and Claire felt a presence behind her. She turned slowly, and there he was, the man from the mirror. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice deep and distorted. Claire stumbled backward, her camera falling from her hands. "This isn't real," she whispered. Dr. Calver stepped closer, the black pits of his eyes drawing her in. "You came looking for the truth. Let me show you." The walls around her dissolved, replaced by a nightmarish vision. Patients strapped to tables screamed as the doctor and his assistants performed unspeakable experiments. Needles, saws, and scalpels glinted in the harsh light. One patient writhed as electricity coursed through her body, smoke rising from her skin. "No," Claire shouted, shutting her eyes. When she opened them, she was back in the sanatorium. The operating room was in shambles, just as it had been before. But something was wrong. Her camera was gone, and her reflection in a shard of glass showed her face pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken. A faint giggle echoed again, and this time it sounded much closer. Claire ran. She sprinted through the corridors, her flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. She reached the entrance hall, but the doors were gone, replaced by a solid wall. Behind her, footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate. She turned and saw the patients, their hollow eyes and bloodied gowns glowing faintly in the dark. They moved toward her, their lips curling into unnatural smiles. The last thing she heard before the darkness consumed her was Dr. Calver's voice, soft and menacing. "You'll make an excellent addition to my collection." Weeks later, hikers found her flashlight just outside the sanatorium gates. Her footage was never recovered. But those who pass by at night swear they see a figure in the windows, a gaunt woman with hollow eyes, forever trapped in Blackwell's haunted halls.